The sun should have hidden itself that morning. It had no business shining on a day like that. The air at St. Matthew's Cemetery was thick with incense and sorrow, the kind that clings to your clothes long after the service ends. I stood beside the open grave, the coffin lowering inch by inch, and I swear, I could still smell her perfume, lavender and rain, slipping away with the breeze. Margaret. My wife of 41 years. My partner in everything that ever mattered. The priest's voice trembled over the final blessing, but through the quiet murmur of prayer and sniffles, another sound pierced through, a whisper, sharp as glass. Finally, everything's ours now. It came from behind me. My son-in-law's voice. Dennis. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Grief does strange things to the mind. But then I saw the corner of his mouth curl upward, just enough to betray the joy he tried to hide. And beside him, my daughter, Clara, lowered her gaze as if she'd just realized what kind of man she'd married. He wasn't talking about healing. He wasn't talking about family. He was talking about the house, the savings, the life Margaret and I had built from scratch, every brick, every penny, every dream. I felt my chest tighten. My hands trembled against the polished wood of the coffin. How could he smile when I could barely breathe? How could someone find celebration in death? The mourners around us tossed handfuls of soil, their voices murmuring the final, ashes to ashes. Dennis's whisper echoed louder in my mind than the priest's prayer. He stood there, his hand on my daughter's shoulder, dressed in a suit too bright for mourning, his tie a shade of gold that glinted with arrogance. That moment, standing between the woman I had buried and the man who was already claiming her world, I knew something inside me had shifted. Grief began to cool into something else. Something steady. Something sharp. Before I continue, I said softly to whoever's listening now, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe love and loyalty should never be taken for granted. They thought my wife's burial was the end of her story. They didn't know she had written one last chapter, and they were about to star in it. My name is Samuel Cole, 66 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I was a husband. For 41 years, Margaret and I lived in a modest brick house on the edge of town, a place we built together, nail by nail, paycheck by paycheck. She was the heart of that home. I was the hands that held it steady. That morning at the burial, I felt like half of me had been buried beside her. People came with practiced condolences. She's in a better place, they said, as if that better place made the emptiness beside me any easier to bear. I nodded through the blur of faces, but all I wanted was for them to leave, to stop touching my shoulder, to stop calling me strong. When the last car pulled away, silence flooded the house. Margaret's teacup was still on the kitchen counter. Her scarf still hung by the door. I sat in her chair, staring at the patch of sunlight she used to love, and realized how cruel quiet could be. Then came the knock. Dennis, my son-in-law, and Clara. They looked like a pair rehearsing sympathy. He carried a casserole he didn't make, she carried the guilt she didn't want to feel. Dad, Clara said softly, we just wanted to check on you. Dennis smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. You shouldn't be alone in this big place. It's too much for one person. Maybe, we can help handle a few things, bills, maintenance, paperwork. Paperwork. He said it casually, but his eyes wandered around the house like a man taking inventory. The framed wedding photo on the mantel, the antique clock Margaret's father left her, the oak cabinet where we kept our documents. I felt something cold crawl through me. I thanked them for coming, but every word tasted bitter. When they left, I watched from the window as Dennis opened the car door for Clara, whispering something that made her glance back toward the house. Then he laughed. That laugh, it didn't belong to a grieving son-in-law. It belonged to a man who thought his plans had already begun. That night, I sat alone in bed, staring at the ceiling. Margaret's side was still cold, untouched. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of her voice, but all I could hear was his whisper at the grave, everything's ours now. I had spent my life teaching respect. As a school principal, I believed in fairness, in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But as I lay there, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, I knew this was different. This wasn't grief. It was greed. Margaret used to tell me, people reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one's watching. That night, I realized I had just witnessed Dennis reveal exactly who he was. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I promised myself one thing: if he thought I was too broken to see what he was doing, he would learn how wrong he was. Because the woman he thought he'd buried had left behind more than memories. She had left behind me. And I wasn't done yet. The morning after the burial, I woke to the smell of burnt coffee and the sound of voices in my kitchen. For a brief second, I thought Margaret was still alive, then I remembered. It was Clara and Dennis. They'd let themselves in. Dennis was already rummaging through the pantry, sleeves rolled up like he owned the place. "Morning, Dad," he said, all cheer. "You didn't have much breakfast food, so I thought I'd fix something." He poured the coffee, dark as tar, then added, "We were talking last night, Clara and I. You shouldn't have to worry about all these responsibilities now. The property taxes, the lawn, the upkeep, it's too much for one man. Maybe it's time to start thinking about simplifying." Simplifying. I'd spent 40 years building this home with Margaret, and he called it complicated. Clara looked nervous. "Dennis, please," she murmured, but he waved her off. He leaned across the counter. "You could sell this place, Dad. Move somewhere quiet, maybe one of those retirement communities. You'd have company, safety, peace of mind." Peace of mind, his version of peace meant surrender. I looked around the kitchen, the tiles Margaret picked, the curtains she sewed. Every corner of that house held her touch. "I'm comfortable here," I said quietly. Dennis chuckled, pretending not to hear the steel in my voice. Of course. But comfort can get expensive. And houses this size? They're just money sitting still. It's time to let your assets breathe a little." Assets. That was the first time he stopped calling it home. When they left, I sat by the window with my cup of coffee gone cold, watching them walk to their car. Clara looked back once, her eyes soft with worry. Dennis didn't bother, he was too busy checking his reflection in the car window. That night, I found them again, their voices leaking through the thin walls of the guest room. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Dennis wasn't exactly quiet. "He's fragile," Dennis said. "Give it a few weeks. Once we get the signatures, we can put the house on the market. I already have a buyer in mind." "Dennis, stop. He's my father," Clara whispered. "Exactly. And this will be for his good. You'll see." His words were smooth, rehearsed, dangerous. I felt something shift inside me, the same way a foundation creaks before a storm. By morning, he'd printed out brochures for senior homes and left them on the dining table, right beside Margaret's framed photo. The message was clear: you don't belong here anymore. I said nothing. I didn't throw them out. I simply placed the brochures inside my desk drawer, the same drawer where Margaret kept our family papers. If he was so interested in documents, I'd start keeping a few of my own. The following weekend, he brought up the house again. "Dad," he began, tone syrupy. "You know, if you sell now, you could live very comfortably for the rest of your life. No worries. No bills. No stress." I met his gaze. "And where would you and Clara live?" He hesitated. "Oh, we'd manage something smaller, maybe invest some of the proceeds. You know, help the family stay afloat." Help the family. That was his favorite phrase, it sounded noble enough to disguise greed. But I saw it now, plain as sunlight through dust. Dennis wasn't helping anyone. He was circling. Waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at Margaret's old desk and opened her photo album. Between the pages, I found an old picture of the house under construction, me in overalls, her holding a hammer bigger than her hand. On the back, she'd written in neat cursive. For every nail you drive, remember. This is more than wood and stone. This is us. Her words burned through me. They thought my grief had blinded me. But that night, I saw everything clearly. Dennis wasn't trying to take a house. He was trying to erase a life's work, mine and hers. And I wasn't going to let him. Not yet. Not ever. 3 days after that conversation, the silence in the house began to suffocate me. Every room felt like an echo of Margaret, her laughter, her voice, her scent. I wandered into her study, the one place Dennis hadn't dared to touch yet. The air still smelled faintly of rose oil and paper. Her reading glasses rested on an open book, the pages curled like they were waiting for her to return. I ran my fingers along the edge of her desk, tracing the grooves she'd left from years of balancing her checkbook, paying bills, planning our life. It was a small, tidy space, a reflection of her mind. On the shelf above, a framed photo of us at our 40th anniversary caught the afternoon light. She was smiling, her head tilted just so. I could almost hear her say, "Don't you dare fall apart, Sam." Not yet. I opened the desk drawer to put away the house brochures Dennis had left. It jammed halfway. I pulled harder, and a thin envelope slipped out from the back, landing on the carpet with a soft thud. My heart stumbled. On the front, written in her neat, steady handwriting, were 4 words. For Samuel, when it's quiet. The seal was still intact. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page, folded carefully, and a small brass key taped to the corner. Her handwriting was elegant, firm, every stroke deliberate. My dearest Samuel. If you are reading this, then the house has fallen too silent, and I am no longer there to fill it. I know you, my love, you'll carry your grief like a stone. But I also know our daughter's husband. Dennis's eyes have always been too quick, too calculating. I fear he will try to build his comfort on the ruins of our life. So, I have made arrangements. I swallowed hard, my eyes blurring as I read on. The key belongs to a safe deposit box at the First National Bank. Inside, you will find documents that will protect what we built, and you. For the past 3 years, I worked with our attorney, Ms. Olivia Grant. She knows everything. Speak to her, and she will guide you. You are the executor of our story, Sam. Keep your calm, but never your guard. You taught generations of children the value of integrity. Now, teach our family what that word truly means. All my love, always, Margaret. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. She had known. She had seen this coming and prepared for it. Even in death, Margaret was thinking 5 moves ahead. I turned the key over in my palm, it was cold and heavy, like a promise. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The young teller guided me to a small room with walls that smelled of metal and old paper. The safe deposit box slid out with a hiss. Inside was a blue folder stamped with gold lettering, Cole Family Legacy Trust. Beneath it was a card from Ms. Olivia Grant, attorney at law, estate and family affairs. I didn't open the folder there. I wanted to read it in Margaret's study, where her presence felt closest. When I returned home, I sat in her chair, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains, and opened the first page. The language was legal, dense, but the meaning was clear. Margaret had moved nearly everything, the savings, the land deed, the investments, into a family trust under one executor, me. The document contained a clause she called the integrity provision. It stated that all beneficiaries' shares would depend entirely on their behavior toward me within the first year after her death. Any act of coercion, disrespect, or manipulation could lead to their inheritance being reduced, or revoked entirely, at my discretion. It was genius. Not out of spite, but of foresight. Margaret had turned love into law. I leaned back in her chair, staring at the neat signature at the bottom of the page, her name written beside mine. A lump rose in my throat. She had planned this quietly, patiently, believing that one day I would need the strength she left behind. I pressed the letter to my chest. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than loss. I felt her hand guiding mine, steady as ever. They thought I was just an old man drowning in sorrow. But my wife had left me a lifeline. And I intended to use it. When I left the bank that morning, the world felt different. The same streets I'd driven for years now looked sharper, clearer, as if the fog of grief had finally lifted. Margaret had left me more than a plan, she'd left me a purpose. Still, I knew I had to move carefully. Dennis thought of me as a harmless, grieving old man. Letting him keep that illusion was my greatest weapon. The next weekend, Clara and Dennis came by again, carrying that same shallow kindness wrapped in polite words. Clara fussed over the curtains, while Dennis set his eyes on the study door. "Dad," he said, scanning the room, "you really shouldn't spend all your time in here. It's not healthy. Maybe we should start clearing some things out. Fresh air, new space, it might help." I looked up slowly from the crossword puzzle I wasn't really solving. "If you think so," I murmured. "You're probably right." That was all he needed, a nod that felt like permission. Over the following days, he and Clara made a routine of dropping by, to help. Dennis started small, replacing furniture, boxing up old photo frames, discarding anything that smelled of age or sentiment. He called it decluttering. I called it what it was, erasure. But I smiled through every visit, thanked him for every insult disguised as assistance. When he swapped Margaret's embroidered cushions for plain gray ones, I simply nodded and said, "Whatever you think is best." He believed that meant surrender. It wasn't. It was surveillance. Every evening, after they left, I took out Margaret's letter and my small notebook. I wrote down the date, what they said, and what they touched. March 19th, Dennis removed Margaret's cushions, said the room felt too sentimental. March 22nd, Clara apologized for him. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She looked away. The notebook grew heavier each night, filled with their words, carefully disguised commands, little jabs about my old habits, their gentle pushes towards selling the house. It was exhausting pretending to be frail, but it worked. They spoke freely around me, confident I was too broken to catch the meaning behind their words. Dennis began suggesting senior living communities again. One afternoon, he placed a glossy brochure on the table, its cover showing smiling retirees by a swimming pool. "You'd love it there," he said. "They even have gardening clubs." I traced the photo with my finger. "Gardens," I repeated softly. Margaret loved gardens. He smiled, mistaking nostalgia for defeat. When they left that day, I tore the brochure in half, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my notebook. Proof. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, watching the sunset through the window. The walls seemed to hum with quiet strength. Margaret's presence was everywhere, steady, patient, reminding me to wait. Dennis was tightening his grip, but he couldn't see that I was tightening mine too. Each time he rearranged something, I made a note. Each time he spoke about what's best for me, I documented it word for word. Every act of false kindness was another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. By April, he was visiting more often than before, always with a new reason. "Just checking in," he'd say. But I saw it, the impatience in his eyes, the calculation behind his smiles. I made sure to play my part perfectly. I let my shoulders droop, my hands shake slightly when I lifted a cup, my voice quiver just enough to sell the illusion. If he saw a man fading, he wouldn't notice the one quietly sharpening his memory. Margaret had told me once, sometimes the only way to win is to let them think they're winning. And now, I understood exactly what she meant. They were building a trap for me. They just didn't know, I was already inside theirs, drawing blueprints for my own. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was heavy with the kind of clouds that never quite commit to rain. I was sitting in the garden, pruning Margaret's roses, the ones she called her living prayers, when I heard the sound of an expensive engine pulling up the driveway. Dennis stepped out first, adjusting his tie, his expression stretched into a smile too polished to be genuine. Clara followed, her eyes darting nervously between us. But it was the man behind them who made my stomach tighten, a stranger in a tailored suit carrying a leather folder. "Dad," Dennis said, voice full of feigned warmth, "this is Mr. Harlan, a property consultant. He was just in the neighborhood, so I thought I'd have him take a quick look around. For an appraisal. Nothing serious. An appraisal." The word tasted like rust in my mouth. I stood slowly, wiped my hands on my trousers, and nodded. "Of course," I said quietly. "If that's what you think is best." Inside, my heart was pounding, but on the surface, I stayed perfectly still. Mr. Harlan walked through the house, making polite remarks about natural light and excellent resale potential. His eyes lingered on Margaret's study, and I had to fight the urge to slam the door shut. Dennis followed him like a proud realtor, already imagining profit margins where love once lived. When they reached the living room, Dennis placed a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, you've done so much for us. Let's make things easier for you now. This house is just too much." He nodded toward the stranger. "Mr. Harlan says the market's hot. You could make a real fortune, enough to live comfortably anywhere." "Anywhere?" I repeated softly. He smiled. "Of course. We'll take care of everything. I've even prepared the documents so we can move fast." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. I recognized the title immediately, Durable Power of Attorney. I stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at him. This would give you control over the sale?" Dennis hesitated, then softened his voice. "It's just to help, Dad. To handle the paperwork, the banks. You wouldn't have to stress about the details." Clara looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. I could see she was torn between love and loyalty, but Dennis didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on me, watching, calculating. I picked up the papers and pretended to squint. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," I said slowly. "I'll need to read this when I'm clearer. Tomorrow, maybe." He sighed, disappointed but confident. "Sure, Dad. Take your time. But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't last." When they finally left, the air in the house felt lighter, as if their greed had been physically weighing it down. I stood there, the papers still in my hands, and then I laughed, not from humor, but from disbelief. He actually thought I'd hand over everything with a signature. That night, I placed the document on the kitchen table, turned on my phone's recorder, and spoke softly into it. April 12th, Dennis presented power of attorney document. Claimed it was, for my own good. Attempted to secure control over property. I saved the file, then sent a message to Ms. Olivia Grant, "We need to talk." He's making his move. The following morning, I met her at her office. The sunlight cut through the tall glass windows, catching the edges of the blue folder Margaret had prepared years before. Ms. Grant listened carefully as I explained everything, the visits, the brochures, the appraisal, the power of attorney. She nodded slowly, her tone calm but firm. "Your wife expected this, Mr. Cole. That's why the trust gives you absolute authority. But now it's time to stop waiting. It's time to document, officially." I nodded. "I've been keeping notes." She smiled faintly. "Good. Keep doing that. Every action, every word. Margaret didn't just protect your assets, she armed you with evidence." I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, control. The kind of quiet, unshakable control that comes from knowing the rules better than the people trying to break them. Dennis thought he was playing chess. What he didn't realize was that Margaret had already set the board. And the next move was mine. The next morning, I drove to Ms. Olivia Grant's office again. She was waiting for me, calm as ever, with a cup of coffee steaming on her desk and a thick folder already open. The city stretched behind her window, cold, structured, unforgiving. "Mr. Cole," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Your wife was a remarkable woman. She didn't just plan an inheritance. She built a fortress." She slid the blue folder toward me. I opened it, and there it was, the Cole Family Legacy Trust. My name embossed in gold beneath Margaret's. Ms. Grant explained it all in detail. For the last 3 years, Margaret had restructured every asset, the house, the savings, even her pension, into a trust that I alone could control. But the brilliance lay in the clause she'd written by hand, signed, and notarized herself. The integrity provision. All inheritance due to any family member is conditional upon their conduct toward the surviving spouse within the first 12 months following my death. The surviving spouse, as sole executor, will record, judge, and determine the outcome. Their word will be final and binding. I sat in silence, the words pressing down on me like the weight of justice itself. "Margaret gave you authority," Ms. Grant continued, "not to punish, but to protect. Every note, every recording, every detail you document will be considered legal evidence." I nodded slowly, still absorbing it. "And if they cross the line?" Her eyes sharpened. "Then you act. You'll have full power to reduce or eliminate their inheritance. If their behavior is malicious, the money transfers to the Margaret Cole Foundation, a charity your wife established quietly before she passed." A small smile tugged at my lips. Of course she did. "She thought of everything," Ms. Grant said. "You were her life's work, Mr. Cole. Now she's given you the tools to protect it." When I left her office, I stood in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing in the cool air. My grief hadn't vanished, it had simply changed shape. It had become purpose. That evening, I started organizing. I moved through the house with deliberate care, setting small traps of truth where Dennis couldn't see them. First, I placed a small audio recorder, the same one I'd used to capture his power of attorney speech, beneath the edge of the living room table. Then another near the kitchen counter, where he loved to lecture me about simplifying my life. I called my old friend George, who had worked in maintenance at the school with me for over 20 years. He arrived quietly the next morning, toolbox in hand. "Sam," he said, glancing at the blueprints I'd spread out, "you sure about this?" "More than ever," I replied. "I'm just making sure I don't forget anything." Together, we installed 3 discrete cameras, one hidden inside the smoke detector in the living room, one in the bookshelf of Margaret's study, and another above the kitchen doorway. They were small, motion-triggered, and silent. When we were done, George gave a low whistle. "You're turning your house into a courtroom." I smiled faintly. "No. Just making sure the truth can speak for itself." That afternoon, Dennis called. His voice was cheerful, almost sing-song. "Dad, just checking in. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, son," I said. "Good, good. Oh, funny thing, one of my friends works with a financial advisor. He says keeping properties tied up after a spouse's passing can be messy. You really should let me help tidy things up." "Of course," I said softly. "Come by tomorrow." When he hung up, I made my next note. April 15th, Dennis insists on handling tidy-up of estate. Intention, control assets. Behavior, manipulative but calm. By now, my notebook had become a ledger, a record of greed dressed in kindness. The next day, Dennis arrived with a folder under his arm and that same golden tie. He walked through the house like an appraiser, not a son-in-law. "Dad," he said, "we could get $500,000 for this place easily." Maybe more. Imagine what you could do with that. I tilted my head. What we could do, you mean? He hesitated for a moment, then laughed. Well, of course. Family, right? He didn't notice the small red light blinking above the curtain rod. Later, Clara called to apologize for his behavior. Her voice was tight, small. He's under pressure, Dad. The business hasn't been good. He's just trying to help. I didn't say what I knew, that Dennis was drowning in debt, that he saw my house as a life raft. I just said, don't worry, Clara. Everything's fine. When I hung up, I looked around the house. Margaret's photograph on the mantel seemed to be watching over it all. That night, I backed up every recording, every audio clip, every note onto a flash drive and placed it inside the safe deposit box with the trust documents. For the first time, I slept soundly. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed, their words, their actions, their schemes. All preserved, all time-stamped, all traceable. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing justice. They thought I was just waiting for my time to pass. But what I was really doing was marking time, until theirs came due. The morning of the will reading came sooner than I expected. It was held at Ms. Olivia Grant's office, a quiet, glass-walled room that smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. The kind of room where truth had nowhere to hide. Dennis arrived first, wearing a navy blue suit and a grin that was trying too hard. He carried a new wristwatch that gleamed under the fluorescent light, a silent announcement that he was already spending what wasn't his. Clara followed quietly, her face pale, her eyes swollen from nights she probably spent arguing with him. Dad, Dennis said, shaking my hand like a man greeting a business partner. Today's going to bring us all some peace, don't you think? I nodded slowly. Peace, I echoed. That's exactly what Margaret wanted. Ms. Grant entered with the folder, the Cole Family Legacy Trust. Her professionalism carried a kind of gravity that settled the room into silence. Thank you all for coming, she began. Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that this reading was personally arranged and recorded by the late Mrs. Margaret Cole. Her instructions were very specific, and all decisions are final. Dennis's grin widened. He leaned back, legs crossed, confident. Clara just folded her hands in her lap. Ms. Grant continued, opening the folder. Mrs. Cole left behind one primary asset, the family estate, valued at approximately $620,000. She also established a trust fund valued at just over $400,000. Dennis's eyes glittered. He shifted in his seat, pretending to be respectful. My mother-in-law was a remarkable woman, he said quickly. Ms. Grant ignored him. However, she said, turning a page, the distribution of these assets is subject to what Mrs. Cole called the integrity provision. Dennis frowned. Integrity what? I watched him, silent. Ms. Grant read directly from the document. All inheritance due to any family member shall depend entirely on their behavior toward my husband, Samuel Cole, within the first 12 months following my passing. The executor, my husband, will serve as the sole judge of character and evidence. Any sign of coercion, disrespect, or greed shall result in immediate forfeiture of all benefits. Dennis's smirk faltered. That can't be legal, he muttered. It's not only legal, Ms. Grant replied smoothly, it's binding. Your wife's mother prepared this with full legal oversight. Mr. Cole is the sole executor. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara looked from Dennis to me, her lips trembling. I took a slow breath and opened the small black notebook I'd brought. Ms. Grant, I said evenly, would you please play the first file from the USB drive in the folder? She nodded, inserted the flash drive into her laptop, and pressed play. From the speakers came Dennis's voice, calm, measured, unmistakable. He's fragile. Give it a few weeks. Once we get the signatures, we can put the house on the market. Then another clip. You could sell this place, Dad. It's too much for one person. The sooner, the better. And another. It's not manipulation, Clara. It's practical. He won't last long. The words hung in the air like poison. Dennis's face drained of color. That's out of context, he sputtered. You can't. I can, I said quietly. And I did. Clara covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. Dennis, please tell me you didn't. He stood abruptly. You think you can play games with me, old man? You think a few recordings will? Ms. Grant's tone cut through his voice like a blade. Mr. Daniels, please sit down. There's more. She clicked the next file. Dad, you really shouldn't be living alone. You might forget things, like your checkbook or your will. Maybe we should start handling that for you. And then my voice on the recording, calm as a mirror. If you think so, Dennis. You're probably right. The room fell silent. Ms. Grant turned off the player and closed the laptop. Mr. Cole, she said, as executor, you may now declare your decision. I looked at Dennis, his arrogance crumbling into panic. You thought kindness was weakness, I said quietly. You thought grief made me blind. But you forgot who taught you integrity in the first place. He tried to speak, but I continued, voice steady. Under the terms of the trust, you forfeit your share of the estate. The funds and property will remain in the trust under the Margaret Cole Foundation. You will receive nothing. Clara gasped. Dennis's eyes blazed. You can't do this. You're ruining your own daughter's future. I turned to her gently. No, Dennis. You did that yourself. He slammed his hands on the table, but Ms. Grant was already standing. The decision is final, she said firmly. Security will escort you out. As the guards entered, Dennis's mask finally broke. He shouted something I'll never forget, not because of the words, but because of how small they sounded. This isn't over. But it was. When the door shut behind him, the room felt lighter. Clara sat trembling, eyes red. Dad, she whispered, I didn't know. I swear I didn't. I nodded softly. I believe you, sweetheart. Your mother did too. That's why she made sure this house would always be yours, when you're ready to come home. She cried then, not out of loss, but out of release. I took Margaret's letter from my coat pocket and placed it on the table. Your mother always said integrity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. Ms. Grant smiled faintly. She was right. I looked out the window at the fading afternoon light. For the first time since the funeral, I felt peace, quiet, honest peace. They thought Margaret's story ended in the grave. They didn't know she had written one last chapter, and today, I read it aloud. After the will reading, the air in Ms. Grant's office felt strangely still, like the moment after a storm when the world hasn't yet realized it's safe to breathe again. Clara sat in silence, her fingers tracing the edge of Margaret's letter as if it were something sacred. Her tears had dried, but her expression carried a mix of shame, relief, and disbelief. Dad, she said quietly, I should have seen it. I should have stopped him. I placed my hand over hers. No, sweetheart. You were trying to love someone who didn't know what love meant. That's not your fault. She looked up, eyes glistening. What happens now? I exhaled slowly. Now, we heal. And we make sure your mother's name continues to stand for everything he never understood, honesty, compassion, and strength. Outside, the afternoon sunlight spilled through the blinds, casting gold lines across the table. It reminded me of Margaret's handwriting, those same patient, deliberate strokes. I could almost hear her voice again, soft but certain, justice is quiet, Sam. It doesn't need applause. Just truth. MS. Grant began packing up the documents. Mr. Cole, she said with a faint smile, I think Margaret would be proud of how you handled today. She's the one who handled it, I replied, voice low. I just followed her map. On our way out, Clara walked beside me, her steps hesitant at first. But by the time we reached the car, she stood taller, her chin lifted slightly, as if she'd finally let go of something that had been weighing her down for years. Are you coming home, Clara? I asked as we reached the parking lot. She nodded slowly. If you'll have me. I smiled. It's still your mother's house. And it'll always have room for you. When we got back, the house felt different, alive again. The air wasn't heavy anymore, it carried the faint scent of roses from the garden. Margaret's roses. I walked to her photo on the mantel, the one from our 40th anniversary, and for the first time, I didn't feel grief. I felt gratitude. Later that evening, Clara made tea, her mother's favorite chamomile blend. We sat in silence for a long while. The house that once echoed with emptiness now felt whole again, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Then she asked, Dad, why didn't you tell him earlier? Why not confront him before it got this far? I stared into my cup, the reflection of the dim light trembling on the surface. Because sometimes, I said, the loudest lesson comes from letting a man dig his own grave. I wanted him to hear the sound of his own greed echoing back at him. She nodded, understanding slowly dawning on her face. He'll never recover from this, will he? Maybe not, I said softly. But that's his burden to carry. Ours is to move forward. The clock in the hallway chimed 7. Somewhere outside, a robin began to sing. It was the same kind of evening Margaret used to love, calm, simple, honest. I took out her letter one last time, the paper worn from my hands. Reading it again didn't hurt anymore, it felt like a benediction. She had known this would happen, known exactly how to protect the life we built. She had trusted me to finish what she started, not with rage, but with grace. I folded it carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and set it beside her photo. As the night deepened, I walked out into the garden. The roses glowed faintly under the porch light, petals trembling in the soft wind. I knelt beside them and whispered, "We did it, love. He won't touch what we made." For a moment, I could swear I felt her presence, that same quiet strength that had guided me all along. Before I end this story, I want to say something to you watching right now. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe loyalty and love should always outlast greed. Because life will always test the good in people. Some will fail. Some will learn. And some, like Margaret, will leave behind a legacy strong enough to outlive betrayal itself. They thought my wife's burial marked the end of her story. But in truth, it was the beginning of mine. A week passed after the will reading, and the house had settled into a rhythm of peace I hadn't known in months. The air was lighter, the silence softer. Even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a heartbeat instead of a countdown. Dennis never came back. I heard through a neighbor that he tried to contest the trust, but Ms. Grant's office shut that down before it began. Without evidence, without money, and without allies, his arrogance finally met the quiet wall of truth. Clara, on the other hand, began to heal. Every morning, she joined me in the garden. We'd prune the roses together, just like Margaret and I used to. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. The silence between us was no longer cold, it was understanding. One evening, she found me sitting on the porch, watching the sunset stretch gold across the lawn. "You look peaceful," she said softly. "I am," I replied. "For the first time in a long while." She smiled faintly. "Mom would be proud of you." I looked at her, then at the fading horizon. "No," I said. "She'd be proud of us, for not letting bitterness take root. Because the truth is, revenge was never my goal. I didn't want Dennis to suffer. I just wanted Margaret's love, her legacy, her integrity, to remain untarnished. That was her final gift, not punishment, but peace earned through patience. That night, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. In the kitchen, the scent of chamomile still lingered from Clara's tea. In the hallway, Margaret's laughter seemed to live inside the walls, faint but eternal. And in the study, her study, I stood before her chair, still tucked neatly under the desk, and whispered, "You were right about everything." The letter lay safely in its envelope, now sealed and kept inside the family trust folder. But her words didn't need reading anymore. They lived in me. A few days later, I met Ms. Grant for lunch to finalize the foundation papers. "The Margaret Cole Foundation," she said, reviewing the documents. "It's officially registered. The trust will continue to fund scholarships for young teachers, just like she wanted." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She always believed good teaching could change the world. Ms. Grant smiled. "Then she still is." When I returned home, I found Clara sitting by the garden with her mother's old scarf wrapped around her shoulders. The evening breeze lifted it gently, just the way Margaret used to wear it. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking, maybe we should reopen Mom's old reading club at the community center. You know, keep her spirit alive." I smiled. That's exactly what she'd want. As the sky deepened into twilight, I realized something important: justice isn't loud or vengeful. It's quiet, steady, and it waits for the right moment to reveal itself. Margaret taught me that. To those of you listening to my story, take it from an old man who's seen love, loss, and the lengths greed will go to protect what matters. Stand your ground, but do it with dignity. Because when truth stands tall, it doesn't need to shout. And before I close, let me say this: if stories like this remind you that loyalty and kindness are worth more than gold, make sure you subscribe for more. I tell these stories not just to pass time, but to keep the lessons alive, the kind you don't learn until life tests you. So yes, Dennis lost everything that day. But I gained something far greater: the peace that comes when love outlasts betrayal. The garden is blooming again now. The roses are in full color, and when the wind moves through them, I swear I can hear Margaret's laughter. They thought her story ended with her burial. But it didn't. It lives here, in every word, every bloom, every breath of peace she left behind. It's been 6 months since that day in Ms. Grant's office, 6 months since the truth finally settled where it belonged. The seasons have changed, and so have I. The house is quieter now, but not empty. It's peaceful. Margaret's presence no longer feels like a ghost haunting the rooms, it feels like sunlight, always there, even behind the clouds. Clara visits every weekend, bringing flowers for the garden and laughter for the silence. We've made it a ritual: tea at sunset, stories about her mother, and sometimes, just the sound of the wind moving through the roses. As for Dennis, the last I heard, he left town. Rumor has it he sold his car, then tried starting over somewhere far away. I don't wish him harm. I just hope that one day he understands what he lost: not money, not property, but trust. The kind of trust you can't buy back once it's broken. I often sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the old oak tree. That's when I talk to her, softly, like she's sitting right beside me. "Margaret," I say, "you'd be happy to see Clara now. She's stronger. Wiser." She smiles again. The wind usually answers with a gentle rustle, as if she's listening. Maybe she is. Sometimes, I wonder if she planned it all knowing how it would end, not with anger, but with peace. Her letter didn't just protect our home, it restored our family's soul. It reminded me that love, when anchored in truth, can outlast every betrayal. I keep her letter framed now, not hidden away. The ink has faded slightly, but the words are still clear. Keep your calm, but never your guard. It's a lesson I'll carry until my last breath. Before I finish, let me say this to you, the one listening to my story: if you've ever been betrayed, don't let bitterness be your revenge. Let patience be. Let truth speak when the time is right. That's what Margaret taught me. That's how justice works best, not through rage, but through grace sharpened by wisdom. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening to our story. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe that love and loyalty should always stand taller than greed. Because in the end, it wasn't the money or the will that defined this story. It was a woman's foresight, a husband's patience, and a truth too strong to stay buried. Her roses are blooming again this year, brighter, bolder, untouched. And every time I see them, I smile and whisper, "We did it, love. We did it right."